Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Shamini Jan with the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, and I am absolutely thrilled that you're joining us today for our very special guest who needs no introduction, but I will introduce her as best I can anyway. We are so honored and pleased to have with us today Pamela Miles. For those of you who don't know Pamela, she is a Reiki master, a yoga and meditation practitioner and teacher, and a biofield researcher. And we are thrilled to have her with us today to share her wisdom and explore this topic of what we call demystifying Reiki, and really exploring the role of spirituality. So, Pamela, thank you so much for joining us today. Starting
Thank
off with
you,
a
Shaman.
bang.
Yes, I just realized that the camera was a little too high, so I'm really excited to be here. I've been thinking about it for days, and I feel like it will be hard for you and I to limit ourselves to an hour or 45 minutes or whatever it is. I just
Indeed.
feel like we could get on the phone and just talk and talk and talk and talk.
Indeed, we could. It's great. Well, I know that you wanted to start us off with a beautiful offering for a distant healing for all of us in the community, and I just think that's wonderful, and I'm sure everyone here is really appreciative of that. So we will follow your lead. We'll just get into receiving mode, everybody on the line, and enjoy, and then we'll get into the dialogue.
Okay, great. And in terms of getting into receiving mode, you can scratch that. You can
Okay.
just be who you are, where you are in the way that is appropriate. So if you're driving, for example, that's a little different than if you're sitting on your sofa at home. Just if you can, you might want to close your eyes. It's
Okay.
completely
Great.
up to you.
Great.
If you're driving, clearly, don't do that. You
Great.
can always listen. If for any reason you feel you cannot comfortably participate in the distant healing that I'm about to offer you, remember you can always come back and listen to the recording. All right, that's an option, because healing spiritual practice is not limited by time and space, but our bodies are limited by time and space. So take care of your body. Right? Take care of your body. And if you're someplace where you can sit comfortably and close your eyes and lean back, that's great. Think of this as an experiment. I don't know how you're going to respond, but I do want to be clear that I'm not doing anything to you. Reiki practice is about as invasive as a butterfly's wings. Right? So have your experience, allow it to unfold from within you. Whatever you do, please don't try to help, don't try to focus, and don't try to relax. Just
There is no try.
there's no try. Yeah,
Okay.
just erase the try part and just be there. And if your mind, and your mind, if your mind needs something to pay attention to be more comfortable, then you can lightly pay attention to your breath without changing your breath in any way. Just notice as it moves in and out of the body with ease, without any effort or direction on your part. Okay. So I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes. And if for any reason you do not want to participate at this point, just silently say no. Because as I'm offering the distant practice, I'll set it up so that it's offered to anyone except the people who say no. And I do mean offered. It's not thrown at you. It's not invasive. It's placed in your proximity. And when you hear my voice again, keep your eyes closed, please, and just listen as I give you a little guidance so we come out of our experience with awareness and gracefully. Please keep your eyes closed a little longer. But become aware of how you're feeling. Just check in with yourself. Notice any little difference in the way you feel now compared to the way you felt when we started just a couple of minutes ago. And then if you like, you can use a couple of longer, slower, deeper breaths to bring your awareness very present in your body. And bring whatever positive change, if you experienced one, with you, very present in your physical form. Don't leave it inside of you someplace, but carry that state embodied in the person sitting in your chair. And wait until you feel very present in your body, aware of the space around you. And only then, let your eyes open slowly, keeping them soft. We often jump out of ourselves through our eyes to get focused on things. Let whatever's around you come to you. And then you can think if there's one word that describes any small difference that you felt, that you noticed, and maybe share it with us when you're ready to move your fingers on your keyboard.
Thank you, Pamela.
You're welcome.
Yeah, anyone who wishes to share their word, as Pamela mentioned, you've got a little keyboard there on the right side of your screen, bottom right. Feel free to toss them out. And I'll just go through a couple of logistics for those of you who are new to the webinar and new to this crowdcast platform. And we're going to have the opportunity to talk with Pamela and also ask her some questions live from you. And the way to do that is actually not through the chat window, but by going to the bottom of your screen, you'll see something there that says ask a question. And I see that many of you have already submitted your questions, which is fantastic. So you just click on ask a question, type in your question. And by the way, if you look and you see that somebody has already asked a question that's pretty much what you were going to ask, you can upvote it. And what we'll do in the last 15 or maybe even 20 minutes is I'll go to those questions and I'll ask Pamela on your behalf, and may even ask you if you want to join her on screen to ask your question directly if that's something that you want to do. Just indicate that in the question for me. And yeah, so really, without further ado here, Pamela, first of all, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure always to get to practice for even a few minutes.
Yeah, it's really beautiful, and I'm seeing lots of words here: rest, relaxation, warmth, relaxed, present. Felt tingles in my face and leg, unattached, peaceful and open. For me, I definitely felt a lightness and a flow of being, which was beautiful. Felt as Reiki often feels for me, a watery type of flow energy. So really, really beautiful. So Pamela, obviously a lot of people joining us today have some sense of Reiki, but not everybody does. And certainly many of us know you and know who you are, but a few of us who are new to the Chi community, kind of new to Reiki, would probably love to hear just a little bit about you and how you came to Reiki and your journey as also a meditation and yoga practitioner and how that kind of connected you with the work.
I'm going to give you the really short version. And if anyone is interested in more details, it's on my website, reikiandmedicine.org. But basically, I've just always been interested in the inner world. I guess I was a pretty odd child, and I would fall into meditation. And so I started studying from books when I was about 10 or 11, and practicing yoga and practicing meditation as I understood it, and noticing that it really made a difference, like on a really practical level. One day when I'd been home from school for a few days sick, and then in the morning when I was going back to school, I felt a little anxious about it because I'd missed a lot. And so I meditated for I don't know how long, but not very long. And I felt totally different. So there was this sense that what's inside of us matters. And I just started, studying the inner life in every way I could. And finally, when I was in my early 20s, I lived in India for a couple of years in an ashram doing, real traditional ashram practices, and sleeping only a few hours a night, but meditating hours, and other practices, and feeling how incredibly restorative spiritual practice is, and really coming to a good relationship with my mind, because that's a big piece of what spirituality is being in relationship with your mind instead of thinking you are your mind.
I love that. Well said. Really well said.
And so, life went on. I came back to the States, and I'd been a professional healer already. Started when I was in college, and then I became a meditation teacher, and I had a 5-year-old, and I was pregnant with my daughter, and just wondering how I was going to continue to do my spiritual practices every day. And a friend of mine took a first-degree Reiki class and offered me a treatment. She said, "I think you'd like it." And she placed her hands on me, and I trusted her, because I'd heard of Reiki, but um, I hadn't come across it in an avenue that felt comfortable to me. I'd seen signs, posters on telephone poles in New York City where I lived, and I wasn't going to do it that way.
Sure.
But I was comfortable with her, and when she placed her hands on the crown of my head, I quickly started feeling sensations that were very familiar to me. Very familiar, because I felt them every day when I meditated. I felt them when I did other spiritual practices. I felt them during acupuncture treatments, or with naive healers who just had a gift for healing, but didn't have a particular technique that they had learned. So by then, I knew that what I was experiencing was not the technique or the practice, but it was my response, that it was my being, my subtle being, reorganizing itself in the direction of a more balanced state. And so I never jumped on the Reiki energy bandwagon. I always was uncomfortable with that model. It felt to me that it was limited, and a little bit like this story that's often told in India, where 4 blind men are describing an elephant, and they describe it totally differently, because one has come across the elephant's tail, one is trying to hug the leg, another has hit the tusk, and the other one is having the elephant tap its head, with his trunk. And so it seemed to me that the model that is largely put forth to this day about Reiki practice, and that's the difference. I talk about Reiki practice. I don't talk about Reiki itself. I don't know what Reiki itself is. I don't know that we can know what it is. But anyway, this, the response was undeniable. It was just what I was looking for, and it was fast and it was easy. And usually those are not values of mine, but in this case, it was just what I needed to be able to continue the daily presence of spiritual practice in my life. Because meditation, right after you have a baby, even, for me, and I meditate easily, it's not so easy. And I think it's because your hormones are totally different. It's not where your body wants to go.
It's, there's so many beautiful points here to touch on that are so important and that you don't often hear from a healing practitioner, if I might say that. And I know, for example, I try not to use the term healer anymore because so many of my colleagues and friends who do healing work don't like the term. And I think you
I don't
alluded to
mind it,
that. Yes.
actually.
Okay, good. I never know these days, so I try to be careful with
Right.
political correctness for healing practitioners, But
Yeah.
some of the things you've just mentioned and shared in your experience are so valuable for us to explore and understand more deeply, because I think in our slice and dice kind of, culture that we have, we've almost separated out the ideas of yoga, meditation, Reiki practice, as being different things. And you just tied it to, first of all, practice. Second of all, our own experience of sensation in the body, which can be found through many different types of practices, right? And so what I believe you're pointing to is the experience of our own, the subtlety of ourselves, put it that way, subtle awareness and subtle energetic awareness, if we'd like to call it that, that can come about through, lots of practices, right? And this is such an important thing because it's, us in the science field, some of us are using this term biofield these days, which, I'm sure you've heard that term. And we describe that as fields of energy and information that guide our health. And so when we talk about the biofield, it's not that there isn't biofield work being done in yoga or meditation or any of these holistic and spiritual practices. And in fact, if I remember correctly, you really describe Reiki as a spiritual practice. And that is all, it sounds like that's part of how you, quote, demystify it, is by saying it's a spiritual practice. And that is
Right.
actually a demystification of it. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic to use demystifying and spirituality in the same sentence like that, but I think that that's because our culture is spiritually illiterate. We don't have language that is meaningful, that we're familiar with. So people confuse spirituality with metaphysics, for example. Metaphysics is really hypothetical. This is what I think is happening. This is what somebody else thinks is happening. Or spirituality is often confused with New Age beliefs, because the New Age movement picked up on the need for more spiritual engagement in our culture, and that's a good thing. But you don't have to subscribe to any particular belief system, because spirituality is really about your relationship with yourself and with being alive. And that's something none of us can escape.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like we're mental beings. We don't have to be Einstein. We're mental beings. We have an intellect. We're emotional beings, and we don't have to be dramatic like a 13-year-old, but we still have emotions. And we're physical beings. We don't have any argument with that. But people often forget that we're spiritual beings. That's our primary essence. That's really who we are. So if we're identifying as being an athlete or an intellect or a rageaholic or whatever it is, and we're not identifying as the spiritual essence that is manifesting in that way, we're missing a whole lot of opportunities. One of them being for happiness.
Very well said. So beautifully well said. And so how does Reiki for you then fit into the picture as a spiritual practice? And you've mentioned you have deep practice in meditation and yoga. You mentioned that when you had this Reiki experience, one of the things you noticed was that it was quick and, it was effective. And certainly we've done studies, right? You've done studies. And one of the things I forgot to mention, for those of you who don't know, Pamela has been involved in a number of different studies at major universities investigating Reiki for clinical populations. And those studies have been done at Harvard and Yale and other places. And Pamela, you're probably aware of some of the research that our group has done investigating other types of energy healing, spiritual healing practices, right? And one of the reasons that we explore that, in addition to looking at things like meditation, is because sometimes you do have situations as a patient where you're wiped out, from cancer treatment, for example. I did a study looking at hands-on healing in the Roche and Bruyere tradition for fatigue survivors. And one of the reasons we looked to this particular healing modality was because to try to get folks to learn meditation in that state, of lack of energy, literally like lack of, what we might call a vital force, right? Was very difficult. And so there was a sense that they needed to be, quote, pumped up first. And so, where do you see sort of the, for lack of a better word, the advantages, or what distinguishes Reiki practice? Say, someone's just starting out, I want to get to know myself, I want to enhance my level of spiritual connection and spiritual well-being. What does Reiki practice have to offer in that regard?
Fast and easy. Because I became a Reiki master after practicing, every day on myself and also professionally for 4 years. Because as a meditation teacher, I saw what you're talking about, that people who would benefit from meditation and even were interested were often not strong enough, not well enough to be able to sustain the effort, or they would come to meditation class. We'd have wonderful meditations together, but then they'd go home and they'd meditate once or twice, and then they decided they couldn't meditate on their own. That they just, something was missing for people. It wasn't as close to them as it was for me. And even when I was learning to meditate, as somebody who found meditation easy, there were still bumps in the road. So when I realized I could teach people to practice on themselves, and number one, there's enough of a do. You place your hands, both if you can, or just
Right.
one. But then also it is an empowered practice. So there's not a technical expertise like you need in yoga, for example. If you don't have a good teacher, if you don't have good technique, you can really hurt yourself with practicing yoga. I mean, more of my clients have been injured in yoga class than in any contact sport.
Unfortunately, people seem to be training in yoga like it's a sport these days. Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, we're talking about yoga asana, which is just one of the 8 limbs of yoga, as
Correct.
you know, and sometimes we think the asana is the whole thing.
Yes. Yeah. It's back to those 4 guys and the elephant.
Right.
You see one thing, and here we have such disregard of the nuance and complexity of spiritual practice, and so much of a been there, done that attitude that we think, oh, well, I took a class and that I had that experience once or twice. I know what's going on there. And people in particular think that everything that is referred to as Reiki is the same practice, which might have been true 40 years ago. But in the 1980s, towards the end of the 1980s, that really started shifting as Americans gave up on the slower training, which involved a lot of practice, and they thought it was enough to get the initiation, and the techniques are pretty simple. And so what we see now is that people are taking training going from 0 to Reiki master, sometimes in a weekend, sometimes in an afternoon, sometimes clicking on a website. And And that's one thing. If it's for their own personal practice, I have nothing to say about that. You know, if something is helping somebody, who cares? If they're not being damaged by it, you know. But then when a week later they're teaching a class, they're teaching other people to practice Reiki, when they don't realize that there's no such thing as a faster master.
No such thing as a faster master. That's another great quote. That's so important. And so for those who may not be familiar, you know, because I know some folks are just kind of getting oriented to energetic spiritual healing techniques, and there are questions about how this differs, for example, from the Barbara Brennan, or you know, other forms of energy and spiritual healing. Tell us a little bit, you know, I know we don't have a lot of time, and I know a lot of this could be found, you know, on websites, and maybe you can direct folks to resources to learn more about the history of Reiki. But just to make sure everyone's on the same page, Reiki was founded by Mikao Usui, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then brought to the West by Takata.
Hoao Takata, and between the two of them, there was one Reiki master who was trained by Usui, the founder, who was Takata's Reiki master. And although we say Takata brought the practice from Japan, in fact, the two of them did.
Got it.
Hayashi came for 6 months, and during those 6 months, Takata was trained as a Reiki master by giving classes in front of her teacher. Imagine that.
Wow.
You know, yeah.
Yes.
And she had already lived in Japan for a year. And, you know, the year, that may not be totally factual. There's a lot of details that just haven't been documented yet. But an extensive amount of time, not a weekend or even a month training. And then she came home at his direction, and he and his daughter followed, and for 6 months they went around Hawaii to the different areas, and you know, giving programs and teaching, and she would teach, and he would give her notes.
So there was this original practice which involved, you know, receiving these initiations, now some people call them attunements, having a certain amount of time and practice that one would do till you move to the next level, and then the next level. And then, as you said, now there's been this explosion. There's many different types of Reiki, as there are ice cream flavors, probably more, right? And very different sort of standards in terms of, you know, whether you need to show how many people you've worked on and things like that. So, and, you know, this leads into questions people have about regulation, you know, of energy healing, and how does one become a Reiki master, and how do you find legitimacy? You know, a lot of people have questions about this. Well, how do I know, you know, if I'm seeing someone who calls them a Reiki master, what kind of training do they have? You know, how many people have they worked on? Do you have any suggestions for people, you know, as they're looking for someone that they might want to work with, either to get a healing from or to learn from?
Yeah, I do. I actually have a few. One is I'd like to direct everybody's attention to what you said about levels of practice, because the understanding tends to be that this is better than that. And that's actually not the case. And I haven't found another way to express it, you know, but it's degrees. So first degree is the hands-on. Second degree is distant practice. It's not better than hands-on, it's different. And you understand that practice, that approach to practice, better if you have a strong foundation in hands-on self-practice. So, for example, my standards are that my students practice on themselves every day for a minimum of 6 months. And they come to at least 3 of my public clinics where they're practicing on other people they don't know. Because that builds a whole other level of conviction. We want people, anybody who's going to put hands on you, you want them to have conviction that when they place their hands, something good is going to happen. Because
important.
Otherwise, they're going to start, and to use another phrase you use, working on you. Reiki practice is not a matter of working on people. It is extraordinarily passive. It's an offering. We place our hands, we don't breach the boundaries of the person.
Mm.
And then the system responds out of its own wisdom. You know, our bodies know how to heal. We just don't give them enough time. You know, we throw a lot of roadblocks in them, in our minds, by, you know, our habits, by not spending time to digest our emotions, for example. And it's the correlation of poor sleep and a host of medical problems has a lot of strong research evidence. You know, so I like to talk about Reiki practice from a physiological perspective because we all agree we have bodies. And instead of measuring things that come out of our hands, which, how do we know we're even measuring the right thing, or that there is a thing? You know, why don't we measure what happens in the person? So with Reiki practice, we have observable benefits, and maybe the people who were with us noticed that their breath changed. That's usually the most common, the fastest response. You know, that the breath just becomes more open, more easeful. Maybe their pulse rate might have gone down. Maybe they had some belly gurgles, you know, as their digestive tract kicked in, or they noticed that they were swallowing a lot. Another indication of the digestive system kicking in, which is a very important physiological response, because that's an indication that you're moving into your ability to self-heal. Because when we're stressed, we don't self-heal, we don't digest, you know, we don't do anything that's not vital to staying alive.
So a couple of questions come to mind. It almost sounds like, you know, what you're saying is ultimately Reiki practice, meditation, yoga are all different paths that are essentially leading us to the same shared reality, which
Yes.
is, you know, getting comfortable with our minds, freeing our energy. Perhaps we could use that. I don't know if you would say that as a metaphor, if you would think of this as being literal, you know, freeing our energy from the constraints, the sankalps, the, you know, the mental formations that come from undigested emotions and habit conditioning, right? That all of these different practices and spiritual practices in general are all really working with that same pathway, but in different practices, different ways of essentially achieving the same thing. And one of the things that I'm hearing you're saying is one of those key, you know, physiological components of this. What we notice in the body when this is going on is that we engage in this rest and digest, you know, aspect of our nervous system. You know, that nervous system aspect that's related to the parasympathetic nervous system, which has been talked about in many, many different books, in, you know, yoga and meditation, and even to some degree, as you say, in energetic healing practices, that by simply allowing us, you know, the time and space to be in ourselves, we're able to access this deeper spiritual wisdom more readily. And that's reflected in our physiology. That's reflected in our lower breathing rate, in, you know, in our heart rate, in the downstream immune effects and hormonal effects that we see with energy healing practices. Am I right? Is
Yes,
that kind of what you're saying?
well, I don't know if you're right, but if you're wrong, I'm wrong with you.
Okay, so in other words, this is we're kind of on the same page here in terms of that sort of understanding that you're coming to with all of the practices that you've been doing. Yeah.
Yeah, that all spiritual practice has the same goal,
Mm-hmm.
to bring us home to ourselves, to encourage our systems to align with our deepest self from within. So it's not like going to a spiritual chiropractor, you know, where you're having these forcible shifts, these interventions, which may be needed at some time. But to allow that to unfold from within is certainly the safest way to go, because we're capitalizing on the wisdom of the individual. And I wouldn't want to have to choose one spiritual practice because I'm like a glutton for spiritual practices.
We
But
like
if
the smorgasbord of practice.
Right.
Yeah.
I have, a number of them that I use regularly and then others that I reach to for different things. But if I had to choose one, it would probably be Reiki practice because of the facility. Because no matter what is happening to you, your mind can be a mess. You could have just fallen down a flight of stairs or been in an accident or coming out of the OR or something. And if you can get your hand to your body, the practice is carried in your hand. And that response
Mm.
can start. And then once the system starts the down regulating, moving out of that sympathetic overdrive into the parasympathetic state, which is the rest and digest and restore
Mm.
state, then all kinds of wonderful things can happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you
Absolutely. Yeah.
and if you have other spiritual practices, or if you're undergoing medical treatment, you're going to get more benefit. It's like one doctor that I trained in the last century said, Reiki practice seems to prime the patient for healing.
I love it.
And I agree. He
Mm-hmm.
was just sharing an experience, something that he noticed practicing on himself and occasionally practicing with patients momentarily, not giving full treatments, momentarily, more like what we just started with, which is different than if you're on the table and you have a 40-minute or an hour treatment.
Very different. It's so we have, I hear you with, wanting to kind of shy away from speculative metaphysics. And yet we have these frameworks, right? We have an idea of what we call the mind, and people have an idea of what they've called the vital. And uh, the intersection between, what we call the mind and what we call the vital, or the vital force, the energy force, has been spoken about in many traditions. And, in fact, in Tibetan tradition, as I'm sure you're aware, and probably other traditions too, they describe the vital as a blind horse and the mind as the lame rider. And so the purposes of, things like yoga or spiritual practice are to unite these flows together. And I bring this up because there are some traditions, for example, for if you're familiar with the Goenka Vipassana tradition, where, people go into 10-day silent meditation retreat. One of the questions they ask you before you enter is, are you an energy practitioner? And there are concerns that this group has about whether or not one can really fully engage in the Vipassana practice if one is used to intentionally moving energy in the body. And so I'm just really curious, from you as a contemplative practitioner for so many years, and a Reiki practitioner, how do you see it?
Well, first of all, as a Reiki practitioner, I'm not deliberately moving anything. And I know it's really hard to pull that apart, but Reiki practice is a non-dual spiritual practice. It's a mere presence effect. And the presence starts with the hand in first degree. I understand. I've come across this with Vipassana, not myself, but other people, have come against that wall. And I wonder if this is just another one of those obstacles that the Reiki community has created for itself, because who knows where that proscription came from, whether it was somebody speaking about Reiki practice, not in the traditional way, but in a very invasive, really more like shamanic practices, but calling it Reiki. And this goes back to your question before, it's like when somebody says, oh yeah, I'm a Reiki master too, or I practice Reiki, we don't know what they're talking about. We have to ask them. And this is true of my students as well. Just this week, I was contacted by a lovely woman who took first and then, some many months later, second degree training with me. I don't know, maybe 7 years ago. And she was telling me how much her life has changed, and had gone to work with a shaman that I had referred her to because she asked.
Hmm.
And when people are looking for other work, I'd rather help them find somebody who's good. I'm good at that. I can tell somebody who has a depth of practice. And so she went to the shaman, and she said, a life-changing experience. And I was very happy for her, but I was curious, why do you think it was the shaman's work and not your daily self-practice?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not taking anything away from that shaman. I mean, it's a wonderful practitioner, but we discount the spiritual practice, and we go all gung-ho for the drama and the intensity of the intervention. And
Mm-hmm.
shamanic practices are interventions.
Yeah.
They're not as invasive as surgery, of course not, but they're still invasive. The shaman has a goal that he or she is working towards. Reiki practice is very different. Spiritual practice in general is very different. You know, if you're meditating for stress reduction, then you're meditating like an intervention. But the question is, are you meditating?
Mm-hmm.
You know, because meditation isn't stress reduction. Stress
Right.
reduction is a byproduct of any spiritual practice.
Yeah. Well,
Meditation, yoga, Reiki, Qigong, you know, chanting, whatever. So, you asked before about tips for how to know if somebody is good with Reiki practice, and I didn't give something really practical there. And we can give a link to an article on my blog that gives
great.
more
Yeah.
more detail. But for people to know right now, you want to read that person's website or get on the phone with them, whatever opportunity that professional offers, and find out, what does this person think Reiki practice is? What are they actually going to do or
Mm-hmm.
not do?
Mm-hmm.
What is their training? You know, because my first Reiki experience was from somebody who'd been practicing maybe a couple of weeks. It was good enough for me, right?
Wow. Wow.
but I knew this was a friend sharing with me. I didn't have the expectations of a professional. I wasn't paying her. So if you're paying a professional, you want to make sure that person has professional experience.
Yes.
If you're their first client, you want to make sure you know that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but you want to have your expectations in alignment with what the practitioner is bringing to the table.
Thank you.
And
That's so valuable.
so
Yes.
you have that
Mhm.
conversation, and I do list several questions to ask, but I just want to jump into the most important question you want to ask. And that is, you ask that professional, do you practice hands-on self
Mhm.
Reiki every day?
Ah, do you practice what you teach and what you give out to
And
others? Yeah.
if the professional says anything other than, yes, of course, I can't imagine a day without my self practice, I encourage you to go to the next,
Mm,
right?
mm, mm,
Because it is through our daily, relentless self practice that we come to understand not only the practice, but the processes of healing. And they are many. You
mm,
know, so somebody who doesn't have a daily self practice and then starts collecting money for services is much more likely to get into intentionality and trying to make something happen, and in other words, to breach your boundaries in
mm,
ways that you might not be
mm.
happy with.
This really ties in so much, and thank you, everybody. We are going to get to your questions. We have many questions from this group. Very engaged group. Thank you guys so much. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We're going to start with the ones that got the most upvotes. So if that's okay with you, Pamela, I want to
Absolutely. Good
honor these
plan.
folks. Yeah. And so the first question that got a tremendous amount of upvotes, you're doing so much to help us understand these fine and very important distinctions potentially. Not sure, honestly, if they are distinctions. It's really great to hear from a deep practitioner like yourself, and your perspective is Reiki as a non-dual practice. Honestly, I've heard very few Reiki practitioners describe it that way. And so this question is related because this person is asking, Catherine is asking, I'm interested in hearing about the differences between Reiki and modalities such as healing touch program and Brennan healing science. So, this I think speaks to a lot of questions people have. There are a lot of different types of these practices. What are the similarities? What are the differences? How do I know which one is for me?
What we really want to do is understand the difference between practice and intervention. So, spiritual practice is self care. It's something we do, we practice. It's a habit, and the practice habit creates habits in our minds and our physiology that helps us be happier and healthier. An intervention is something that you do to create a specific outcome. So there are many, many fine, energetic interventions like healing touch, therapeutic touch, Rosalind Bruyère's work, Barbara Brennan, Donna Eden. We're lucky to have such a glut of great practices to choose from. And I said practices, but they're really interventions because you're doing it for a specific reason. If I have a headache, I don't necessarily put my hand on my head. Reiki practice balances, helps the system to balance. And as the system balances, a lot of symptoms are going to just go by the wayside as a byproduct of that balance.
And I hear similarities, with practitioners from the Brennan tradition, Rosalind's tradition, which, I've received some training from Rosalind and regard her as a dear mentor. And there is, I think, really these wonderful, shades of color between the practices where I feel that many healers are saying similar things, right? That, ultimately I'm facilitating the opportunity for this person to galvanize their healing response, right? That healing is not something I am doing to you, but I'm creating the conditions for healing to happen. So we hear this over and over by many healing practitioners. But this point that you make is very important, the interventional and the intentional components, because you do have some of these practices that have and I call them practices, that have very specific techniques, right? And it's believed that by doing this particular technique, there's pain drain or there's chakra connection, or, so they have been designed to address specific, you can say, symptomatology or particular issues. And, what I
To
hear from
make
you,
something happen.
yes, to make something happen. Whereas Satnam Rasayam, which sounds to me, in its description from the Kundalini yoga tradition, similar to how you're describing Reiki practice, is very much about simply being and allowing flow to take place. And so there's no intentional alteration or interventional aspect to that work whatsoever. So there really is this wide spectrum, and I dare say we need to clarify this better for our community, and even
Yeah,
among ourselves as practitioners.
and talking about them as polar opposites can be helpful in terms of clarifying our understanding. But as you said, there's an awful lot of nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And someone could be saying, oh, I practice Reiki, but they're really like, drilling in a very deliberate way with a lot of intentionality, trying to create a specific outcome, whereas someone else may be using shamanic techniques with, so much detachment and clarity.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to look for somebody who is not only well trained in whatever their practice or technique is, but also look at their state.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yes, very important. It actually relates to our next question, which also got a lot of upvotes, which is, how does one know if Reiki only accesses benevolent energies and not negative ones?
Well, that's a really good question. And I don't think of Reiki practice as accessing any energies. What it does, and we can document this, is according to a mechanism that we don't understand. Okay, the mechanism is not yet recognized or defined. But when we practice Reiki either on ourselves or we practice on someone else, the person receiving the treatment has a fairly predictable response in that. And that may be because most people in our culture are upregulated, they're stressed. So a balancing self-healing response is going to involve some degree of relaxation.
So what if I try to pin this down a little bit further, if I might? Because many Reiki practitioners will say we're working with universal life energy. Some people will say we're working with God force, right? Reiki cannot do harm, as Susan says right here in the chat window. So what are your perspectives of that? If someone asked you, well, where is the origin of this energy? What would you say?
That's another good question. You can ask me from any perspective you want, but the reality is, I'm not being cagey here. I don't think in terms of energy. And I think that this whole focus on energy and the idea of attuning to a Reiki energy, and it's this kind of energy or that kind of energy, I think it was the result of a mistranslation. The translation that we have was given to us by Hawayo Takata, whom I have so much gratitude and respect for. But she was translating this at a time when she was just beginning her practice. And, she was a work in progress too. And her understanding ripened and refined as she continued to practice for 42 years after Hayashi left her in Hawaii. And the whole idea of force, to me, whether you sweeten it by calling it life force or vital force, it's still force. It still implies duality.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a non-dual practice, that cannot be the bottom line. Because a non-dual practice brings us back to the experience of oneness, which I think is the birthright of all of us. It exists and is thriving within all of us if only we would look inside. So ultimately, if oneness is the ultimate reality, it's unmanifest, it's non-dual, it's everywhere all the time. So it has to be unmanifest. And the way to get to that experience is inside. As I often tell my students, the way out is in. Ultimately, once you're in that oneness awareness, there is no in or out, right? Because it's one.
Right, it's one.
But you can't keep spinning out and out and out and get to that experience. You have to drop inside. You have to be willing to just, as Ram Dass said so many decades ago, be here now and be who you are here now, and be willing to be content with that, because that's where you start.
Oh, so beautiful. Pamela, I cannot tell you what a treasure of a conversation this is. I mean, on so many levels, I'm so deeply grateful to you for sharing your perspective and wisdom here. It's a perspective, I would say, that is deeply needed and is not necessarily given voice. There's a lot more voice that needs to be given to perspectives, healing perspectives, understanding what this is. And you've just so eloquently today began to expand our understanding of these links between spiritual practice, non-duality, and Reiki practice in a way that, quite frankly, it's so refreshing and so needed, because we haven't yet even begun to connect the dots between healing practices and healing traditions, let alone these spiritual practices like meditation. And often we see these as so separate, and you're really helping us to make those links. And ultimately, all roads lead to oneness, as you say. And, I think many of the things that you say are, going to be considered maybe even controversial among some of,
Maybe.
of the healing practitioners. And some of them are going to say, right on, that's exactly, she's got it completely right. And, it's just, and as you say, I think we could speak about this for hours, and I hope we certainly have the opportunity to dive in even deeper with you. I know we're getting close to the hour, so yes, indeed, we have a comment. Pamela Miles rocks. I love her. Agreed. And if you look in the chat window, if you want to learn more about Pamela, we have a couple of websites in the chat window here, PamelaMiles.com and ReikiMedicine.org. And Pamela, anything else that you want folks here to know about ways to get in touch, any things that you're offering?
Well, I have some gifts that I would like to offer you. One is a 3-week series of very, very short emails. And you don't have to be a Reiki practitioner to benefit from these. You just have to sign up, and you can always unsubscribe.
Great.
But just every day to get a short email that reminds you you could be flexing your happiness muscle right now, no matter what's happening. And the other is a recording of I think it's like a 3.5 minute meditation, breath meditation from my Meditate CD that I did with a dear friend who is a phenomenal Bansuri flutist, Steve Gorn. And so that's one track, and
Great.
you're welcome to it. And and if you like it, then maybe the whole CD is something you'd want to take a look at to help you build a meditation practice.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you for those offerings. It's great. And Jason's got it here in the chat window, Reiki Medicine and, the app form Happiness. So you can click on that link and take advantage of that offer. And for those of you who are new to Chi, and I know there were some questions about, will this be available after the fact? We are going to keep this up for 48 hours for sure. And it's also streaming on social media. For those of you who are new to our community, we're a collaborative to help lead humanity to heal ourselves. And we're a nonprofit. The way that we survive, quite frankly, is through give and receive. So we're able to do these webinars, send really fabulous newsletters, and provide other educational offerings due to the gratitude of our community. So there is a little button here that says Join Chi, Learn More. And we do offer all webinars, including any PDFs. Some of our folks are scientists and share data around studies, free monthly meditations, everything in perpetuity, discounts to conferences, many different things, all for the cup of probably a matcha latte a month, about $60 a year, and it's a tax-deductible donation. So for those of you who are interested in learning more, we invite you to do that and stay connected with the Chi community as well as with Pamela. Gosh, Pamela, thank you again so much.
May I say one other thing?
Please.
Shamini, actually two things. First of all, I want to thank you because of your interest in talking about practice with this depth. It's so appreciated, and especially as spiritual practice and Reiki in particular moves into hospital, it's really important that it does so as a spiritual practice instead of just another technique. And then the other is for anyone who would like to learn to practice Reiki, by far the best situation is to find a qualified and credible Reiki master near you, where you can go and be in the room with that person and a small group of other students, because we learn from each other. But if you cannot, I offer a teleconference like this, Reiki, I call it Reiki self-care training, so that you can learn to practice on yourself. It's not a full first degree training, because in my first degree classes, we also practice with one another, and we can't do that in a teleconference. But the response has been very good. And it, of course, makes the training available to people who don't have other options. So we don't want to be perfectionists. We want to get the best we can so that we can start taking better care of ourselves. And we'll put the link to that somewhere. We'll make sure you get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, thank you for all these, the wisdom, the resources, your continued service to, you know, all of humanity and the community here. It's very much appreciated, Pamela, and, you know, certainly look forward to engaging with you more, you know, as we traverse this journey together.
I like that word, together.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much,
thank
Shamini, and for
you.
all that you do,
Yeah.
and all the people whose lives you enrich both professionally and personally.
Thank you. Likewise. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you soon again. Take care.